He grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee, raised by his great-grandmother in a house where his father was absent, and the South was still a place that told black men exactly what they were worth. He stuttered as a child and learned to manage it by pretending to be other people, by stepping inside characters who did not carry the same weight he carried. That habit became a career. That career became something no one in Chattanooga in the 1950s could have predicted. The highest grossing actor in the history of cinema. A man whose face and voice are recognizable in virtually every country on earth. But there was something Samuel L. Jackson did not know about himself. Not a rumor, not a family secret, something older than any living memory. Something buried so deep in the machinery of the transatlantic slave trade that no document in any American archive had ever been able to reach it. The name of the man who was taken, the specific place on the African continent from which his family's line had been severed, the people his ancestors had belonged to before the crossing, erased everything. DNA found it. Before we dive in, tell us where you are watching from and click subscribe. Samuel Leroy Jackson was born on December 21st, 1948 in Washington, D.C., and was raised in Chattanooga by his great-grandmother Carrie after his parents separated early in his life. His father, Roy Henry Jackson, moved to Philadelphia and was largely absent, a figure at the edges of Samuel's childhood. He died of alcoholism before they ever built the relationship that did not form when Samuel was young. His mother, Elizabeth, worked in a factory. The household that raised him belonged to his great-grandmother in a city where the color line was enforced through law, through custom, and through violence, where the world of a black child was defined at every turn by what it was not permitted to be. He found his footing through performance, the stutter that marked his early years. That difficulty getting words out in his own voice became manageable when he was speaking in someone else's voice. When he was a character, the words came. That discovery, made in childhood, became the engine of one of the most prolific careers in the history of American film. By the time the DNA results came back, Samuel L. Jackson's films had collectively grossed more than $27 billion worldwide. He is not simply famous. He is, by the measure of box office returns, the single most commercially successful actor who has ever lived. And yet, the question of where he actually came from, not from Chattanooga, not from the American South, but from the continent on the other side of the Atlantic crossing that had brought his ancestors into the American plantation system, had never been answered. It could not be answered by any document in any archive. It could only be answered by the one tool that reaches past the wall, where the paper trail ends and recovers what slavery tried to make unrecoverable. Chattanooga, in the 1950s and 1960s, was not a place that encouraged black children to imagine they had origins worth knowing about. The city was segregated by law and by violence, the kind of southern city where a black man knew which sidewalk to walk on, which water fountain to use, which door to enter through, which ambitions were permitted, and which would be punished. Samuel L. Jackson attended a segregated elementary school. He watched the civil rights movement unfold around him, watched the sit-ins and the marches and the fire hoses on television and in the streets of his own city. He attended Morehouse College in Atlanta, the historically black institution that had also educated Martin Luther King Jr., and became politically active, serving briefly as a marshal at King's funeral in 1968. He was suspended from Morehouse after holding members of the Board of Trustees hostage as a protest against the college's governance. He struggled with drug addiction for years. He got sober at 40, and then his career took off in a way that no one had predicted and that he himself had not entirely expected. None of that history, not the segregated schools, not the civil rights activism, not the addiction and the recovery and the late blooming career, told him where his family had come from before Chattanooga, before Tennessee, before the American South and the plantation system that had put his ancestors there without their consent and without any record of what they had been before the crossing. His family story, like the story of nearly every Black American family, runs into that wall somewhere in the 1860s. The census of 1870, the first census to record African Americans by name after emancipation, is the beginning of the documentary record for most Black American families. Before it, the archives hold slave schedules, lists of people recorded by age and gender and color, without names, without origins, without any information that acknowledged them as human beings. The men and women in those schedules came from somewhere in Africa, where specifically which nations, which peoples, which communities had been taken and carried across the ocean was not recorded, not because the information was unknown at the time of their arrival, but because it was not considered worth recording. The people were property. Property does not have origins worth documenting. For Samuel L. Jackson's family, the paper trail runs back through Chattanooga and the Jim Crow South and the decades of sharecropping and enforced poverty that followed emancipation. It runs back to the names of enslaved ancestors that the records, where they survive at all, recorded only partially. It runs back to the third great-grandfather whom the Finding Your Roots researchers identified, a man named Joel Branham, confirmed by the documentary evidence as a direct ancestor in Samuel L. Jackson's paternal line. That was the paper trail's edge. Beyond Joel Branham, the documents offered nothing. The names stopped. The places stopped. The trail ended where the archive had always ended for Black American families, at the boundary that slavery had built and maintained for 2 centuries. That was where the DNA began. The tool that Henry Louis Gates and his team applied to Samuel L. Jackson's ancestry was Y chromosome DNA testing, the analysis of the direct paternal line. That is the unbroken chain of fathers and sons, stretching backward through time. Y chromosome DNA is passed from father to son, unchanged or nearly unchanged, across generations. It carries, in its specific sequences and mutations, a record of ancient migration patterns, of where specific human populations originated and how they moved across the African continent and eventually out of it. When a geneticist reads a Y chromosome haplogroup, they are reading a map of deep history. Not the history of the last 200 years, which the documents can partially recover. The history of the last 10,000 years, which only the genome preserves. Samuel L. Jackson's Y DNA haplogroup pointed to a specific people, a specific place, a specific community on the African continent whose descendants had been entered into the Atlantic slave trade and moved across the ocean and were distributed across the plantations of the American South in the centuries before emancipation. The Benga people of Gabon, not West Africa, not the Gold Coast or the Niger Delta or the Senegambian corridor, the regions that produce the majority of enslaved people brought to North America and that dominate the ancestry results of most African Americans who test today. Central Africa, Gabon, on the western coast of the continent, just south of the equator, in the region that European slavers called the Loango Coast. The Benga are a Bantu-speaking people whose communities have occupied the coastal and river areas of what is now Gabon for centuries. They are fishermen and traders, people whose culture is organized around the water, around the rivers and the Atlantic coast that their ancestors navigated long before European ships arrived to change the terms of that relationship catastrophically. The Bantu peoples are one of the great human migration stories. Beginning roughly 3,000 years ago, Bantu-speaking populations spread out from what is now Cameroon and Nigeria, moving south and east across sub-Saharan Africa in a series of migrations that eventually populated most of the continent below the Sahara. They carried their languages with them, languages that, despite the enormous distances covered, still share enough structural similarity that linguists can identify them as a family. The Benga are one of the hundreds of Bantu-speaking groups that descended from that original expansion. Their specific territory, their specific culture, their specific history as a coastal people are the particulars that Samuel L. Jackson's Y DNA pointed toward when the analysis came back. To understand what that result means, it helps to understand what the Loango Coast was in the context of the transatlantic slave trade. The Loango Coast, the stretch of Central African coastline that runs from what is now southern Gabon through the Republic of Congo and into northern Angola, was one of the major embarkation points for enslaved Africans shipped to the Americas. Between roughly 1660 and 1860, an estimated 1 to 2 million people were taken from this coast and loaded onto ships bound for the Caribbean, Brazil, and the North American colonies. The communities along the Loango Coast, including the Benga, the Vili, the Yombu, and others, were devastated by the trade. Their populations were depleted, their social structures were disrupted, their relationship to the interior of the continent was altered by the demand of coastal brokers who traded human beings for European manufactured goods. The Loango Coast slave trade is less studied than the trade from West Africa's Gold Coast or the Bight of Benin, but its scale was enormous, and its impact on the communities it targeted was catastrophic. The Benga people specifically were a coastal Bantu-speaking community, fishermen and traders who had lived along the rivers and coastline of what is now Gabon for centuries before the European ships arrived. They were not isolated from the trade. Their proximity to the coast made them both participants in it at times and victims of it. Men and women from Benga communities appear in the historical record as enslaved people shipped to the Americas across multiple centuries of the trade. Some of their descendants are in the United States. One of those descendants, through a direct paternal line that the Y chromosome preserved unchanged across the crossing and the generations that followed, is Samuel L. Jackson. That result was not a probability, not an estimate, not the kind of percentage breakdown that autosomal DNA produces, useful and informative, but inherently approximate. Y chromosome haplogroup assignment is a direct ancestral identification. The sequence in Samuel L. Jackson's DNA matched the Benga people of Gabon with the specificity that comes from following a single unbroken line of inheritance all the way back through time. The man who fathered his father's 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 father, and however many more generations back the chain extends before it reaches the Middle Passage, was a Benga man, or a man whose people were Benga. The Y chromosome does not lie about the paternal line. When Samuel L. Jackson received those results, he did not receive them as an abstraction. He received them as an invitation. In 2019, he traveled to Gabon. He met with President Ali Bongo on Demba. He visited the communities of the Benga people on the Gabonese coast. He was welcomed back, that is the word that matters here, welcomed back by a people who recognized in his return the closing of a circle that the slave trade had forced open 3 or 4 centuries earlier. He was granted Gabonese citizenship. That is not a small thing. A passport, a legal recognition by the government of Gabon that Samuel L. Jackson belongs to the nation his paternal ancestors came from, that the Atlantic crossing, the forced migration, the Middle Passage, the displacement into the American plantation system that erased everything about where his family had come from, had not permanently severed the connection. DNA had recovered it. The government of Gabon had formalized it. The man who grew up stuttering in Chattanooga, who had learned to speak by becoming other people, who had built a career on the ability to inhabit roles that were not his own, that man was also, formally and legally, Gabonese. The Benga people, when they welcomed Samuel L. Jackson, were not simply being hospitable to a famous American. They were making a specific claim about what his presence meant. They had lost members of their community to the slave trade. The DNA confirmed that at least one of those lost members had a descendant who had survived everything that the system of American slavery had imposed on him and his family, and who had come back, not as a tourist, not as a celebrity making a goodwill visit, as a son of the Benga, carrying in his Y chromosome the genetic signature of the men who had lived on that coast before the ships came. The Finding Your Roots episode that revealed this also confirmed the broader picture of Samuel L. Jackson's ancestry. The Y chromosome told the story of the direct paternal line, Autosomal DNA, the genetic material inherited from all ancestors, mixed across generations, filled in the rest. The European ancestry that showed up in his results was consistent with what the historical record would predict. The legacy of sexual violence that entered virtually every Black American family line through the plantation system, in proportions that varied but were rarely absent. The African ancestry, spread across multiple West and Central African populations, reflected the complex and overlapping origins that characterize most African American family trees, the product not of a single crossing from a single place, but of multiple lines of descent from multiple African communities, brought together by the trade and then by the generations that followed. But the Y chromosome story was the one that changed something, not just for Samuel L. Jackson personally, but for the broader understanding of where African Americans actually come from. The Benga people of Gabon are not a commonly cited origin in the African American ancestry conversation. West Africa dominates that conversation. The Yoruba, the Akan, the Wolof, the Fon, the Igbo, because West Africa supplied the largest share of enslaved people brought to North America and therefore appears most frequently in African American DNA results. Central Africa, including Gabon, contributed a smaller but real portion of that population. The Loango Coast, where the Benga lived, was a source of enslaved people for centuries. The trade routes that passed through it have left genetic traces in Black American communities that are only now being identified with the precision that Y chromosome testing allows. Samuel L. Jackson's result is part of that identification. His paternal haplogroup connects him to a specific community whose members were taken and whose descendants are now, because of the DNA, findable. Not all of them, not even most of them, but some. The genome preserves what the ships tried to erase. In 2020, the year after he received his Gabonese citizenship, Samuel L. Jackson hosted a documentary series called Enslaved, 6 episodes tracing the history of the transatlantic slave trade, produced in partnership with the Smithsonian Channel, filmed across 4 continents and 11 countries. He did it because the DNA result had made the history personal in a way it had not been before. Not because he had not known slavery's history, he had lived with its aftermath every day of his life in Chattanooga, but because now he knew specifically whose story it was. The Benga of Gabon were not a statistic in a history book. They were his people. Their loss was his family's loss. Consider what it means to go back. Not as a tourist, not as a celebrity making a goodwill appearance in a country that has invited him because of his fame, but as someone whose DNA has confirmed a specific connection to a specific people, a connection that the slave trade severed and that science 3 centuries later recovered. Samuel L. Jackson, standing on the coast of Gabon, was not performing anything. He was not playing a role. He was the person the Y chromosome said he was, a son of the Benga, returned to a coast that his ancestor had left on a ship that did not ask his permission. The Gabonese government's decision to grant him citizenship was itself a statement, not a symbolic gesture, but a legal act. It said that the connection the DNA had identified was real enough to be formalized, that the journey the slave trade had forced was, in some sense, reversible. Not completely, not in the ways that matter most. The people who were taken cannot be given back their lives. The generations that were born into bondage cannot be unborn from it. The cultures and languages and relationships that were destroyed in the crossing cannot be recovered from the genome. But the name, the specific name of the people, the specific place on the coast, the specific community whose son was taken and whose descendant is now a citizen, that can be given back. The DNA gave it back. The passport formalized it. The man who found his voice by becoming other people eventually found his origin by reading the one document that cannot be faked or altered or lost in a courthouse fire. The Y chromosome passed from his Benga ancestor into every son in the line, through the Atlantic crossing, and the plantation system, and the Jim Crow South, and the absent father, and the great-grandmother's house in Chattanooga, and the stuttering child who learned to speak by pretending to be someone else, and it arrived here, intact, carrying the name of the people it came from, the Benga, Gabon, the western coast of Central Africa, where the rivers meet the Atlantic, and a community of fishermen and traders once lived, without knowing that some of their sons would be taken across the ocean, and that one of those sons would eventually produce the highest grossing actor in the history of cinema. The paper trail gave Joel Branham, the DNA gave the Benga. Both of them are true, and the question that neither the document nor the genome can fully answer: what did the crossing cost in specific human terms, in specific names and stories and communities shattered, is the one that Samuel L. Jackson spent 6 episodes of a documentary trying to put into words. He came back to Gabon with a passport. He brought with him everything his ancestors had built on the other side of the crossing. It was not enough to replace what was taken. It was not meant to be. It was what the science made possible: a return, partial and imperfect and real, to the place where the thread had been cut. The thread had been cut. The DNA found the other end of it, and across 3 centuries of silence, the connection held.